Thank you. I am delighted to be here this evening, and even more delighted to introduce Lionel Shriver, who needs no introduction, so I'm going to keep it short. Lionel was born in North Carolina and now lives most of the time in London. She has written 10 novels, including her most recent, The Last Republic, which you will be reading from shortly. Her work spans an amazing breadth, thematically and geographically. She's a master of psychological portraiture who unflinchingly swan dives into human no-go territory regularly. She's also the only novelist writing today I can think of who's able to take themes like demography and medical insurance and turn it into riveting page-turners. She's also very, very, very funny. Ladies and gentlemen, Lionel Shriver.
Thanks, Anne. Those of you who have often frequented literary readings may be relieved to gather that my reading is going to be very short. The New Republic's protagonist is a man who has conceived serial entrancements his whole life. And this seminal fixation was in high school when he effectively fell in love in a heterosexual way with the high school golden boy, Toby Falconer. And he's repeated this sequentially into his adulthood. But meanwhile, he's always followed the fortunes of Toby Falconer, who became a foreign correspondent. And he's continually buying the newspaper in which Falconer appears, but then he won't read the articles. And that's expressive of the kind of ambivalence that he has about this, what he perceives as a problem. It's actually the nicest thing about him that he is constantly admiring others, but he believes that it's a sign of weakness. I'm going to read a couple of pages from the very first chapter so that a great deal of explanation is not required. And you have just discovered that Edgar has ditched a successful career in corporate law to become a foreign correspondent too. And he hasn't really examined to what degree this has to do with his old friend. When Edgar ditched his promising career in corporate law, though what it promised, of course, was more corporate law, in order to try his hand at journalism 6 months ago, he'd been reluctant to examine in what measure this impetuous and financially suicidal reinvention might have been influenced by his old high school running buddy, who, having always obtained the funnier friends, the prettier girls, and the sexier summer jobs, had naturally secured the jazzier vocation. If Toby Falconer and Edgar Kellogg were both drawn to journalism in the fullness of time, maybe the convergence merely indicated that the two boys had more in common at Yardley Prep than Edgar had ever dared believe as a kid. Dream on. To imagine he bore any resemblance to Falconer in adolescence was so vain as to be fanciful. Toby Falconer was a specimen. No doubt every high school had one, though the singular was incongruous as a type. Presumably, there was no one else like him. Al Falconer was the kind of guy about whom other people couldn't stop talking. He managed to be the center of attention when he wasn't even there. He always got girls, but more to the point, he got the girl. Whichever dish you yourself envisioned with the bathroom door closed, she'd be smitten with our hero instead. Some cachet would rub off, of course, but if you hung with a Falconer, you'd spend most of your dates fielding questions about his troubled childhood. A Falconer's liberty was almost perfectly unfettered, because he was never punished for his sins. Anyway, a Falconer's sins wouldn't seem depraved, but merely naughty, waggish, or rather enchanting, really. Part of the package without which a falconer wouldn't be the endearing rogue whom we know and love and infinitely forgive. Besides, who would risk his displeasure by bringing him to book? He did everything with flair, not only because he was socially adroit, but because the definition of flair in his circle was however the falconer did whatever the falconer did. To what extent a falconer's magnetism could be ascribed to physical beauty was impossible to determine. Good looks couldn't have hurt. Still, if a falconer had any deviant feature, a lumpy nose, or a single continuous eyebrow, that feature would simply serve to reconfigure the beautiful as archetype. A falconer set the standard, so by his very nature could not appear unattractive, make a plainly stupid remark, or do anything awkward at which others would laugh, save in an ardent, collusive, or sycophantic spirit. Hitherto, Edgar had been the falconer's counterpart, that symbiotic creature without which a falconer could not exist. The much admired required the admirer, and to his own dismay, Edgar had more than once applied for the position. While he'd far have preferred the role of BMOC if the post were going begging, he was eternally trapped by a catch-22. In yearning to be admired himself, he was bound to admire other people who were admirable, which made him, necessarily, a fan. To date, the only weapon that had overthrown a falconer's tyranny was cruel, disciplined disillusionment. Sometimes a falconer turned out to be a fraud. Lo and behold, he could be clumsy if you kept watch. At length it proved thoroughly possible, if you forced yourself, to laugh at his foibles in a fashion that was less than flattering. Wising up was painful at first, but a relief, and when all was said and done, Edgar would be lonely, but free. Yet taking the anointed down a peg or two was a puzzling, even depressing exercise, in consequence of which he reserved his most scathing denunciations for the very people with whom he had once been most powerfully entranced. Edgar's public manner, gruff, tough, wary, and deadpan, was wildly discrepant with his secret weakness for becoming captivated by passing falconers, and he worried privately that the whole purpose of his crusty exterior was to contain an inside full of goo. He couldn't bear to conceive himself as a sidekick. Having ever been slavishly enthralled to an idol of any sort shamed him almost as much as having once been fat. Hence, of Edgar's several ambitions at 37, the most dominant was never to succumb to the enchantment of a falconer again. It was in the grip of precisely this resolution that Edgar Kellogg marched out of Leonthal 6 months ago, determined to cast off the dreary Burberry of the overpaid schmo. At last he would grow into the grander mantle of standard-bearer, trendsetter, and cultural icon. It was in the grip of this same resolution that Edgar set off for his 4 p.m. job interview with Falconer's newspaper, The National Record. He'd had it with being the fan. He wanted to be the man.
I wanted to begin with where we are right now, and that is the library. As Tina was mentioning in her introduction, the library here has been under incredible cuts. You've written about your debt to the library in your work. I was curious to have you elaborate about that.
Well, I'm afraid there's nothing more tedious than people going on and on about how great libraries are. It's one of those earnest subjects.
Come visit Toronto. We don't talk about it very much here.
I'm keen on them. I think they're swell. We'll keep it at that. And I used them heavily in the early part of my life when I was broke. And, you know, I had somebody the other day come up to one of my readings and apologize for having checked my books out of the library. And it's true that I don't make a lot of money from that, but I don't think there's anything to apologize for about it. And I've actually got myself in a bit of a fix because I let it out that because I don't have any kids, what little of my estate I have not managed to spend wildly before I die is probably going to go to libraries. And I cited this library in Belfast where I checked out lots of books when I lived there in the 1990s. And the Belfast Education and Library Board has got wind of this. It's a little scary. I actually expect these people to show up at my door with a gun.
That you don't want. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to ask you also a question I'm sure you by now must absolutely despise, and that is about your naming of yourself. So, how did Lionel emerge from Margaret Ann Shriver?
Would you want to be Margaret Ann?
That was my mother's name, so.
Your mother's name was Margaret Ann?
Was.
Did she go by both of them?
Margaret.
Not much better.
You're evading the question.
Do I look like a Margaret Ann to you? Well, that's really the end of it.
Okay. Now, the reason I ask is because having read, I think, almost all of your books, naming is a very important element. The names in your novels are almost Dickensian in terms of placement of ethnicity, of character. To what extent is a character's name part of the creative process for you in the evolution of a character?
I do think naming is very powerful in general, right? And that's why I felt compelled to name myself. It is an act of creation, and so as soon as something or someone has a name, it comes into being. I don't think it's just me. It's not a writerly thing to say. I think we are verbal creatures, and this business of giving labels to things, it's a kind of possession, and things that don't have names for us aren't real. And I love naming characters. Frankly, one of the things I like about it is that I have to do the naming of characters before I start the book, so I can spend a whole lot of time on it. You know, it's great procrastination. But I like the sound of names. I don't have any particular philosophy, but I try to play with just the sound in the ear, whether they're hard or mellifluous, and also whatever associations they might have. Just an example out of the air, Franklin Plaskett in We Need to Talk About Kevin, the husband. I chose that first name Franklin because he's a Republican, and he's a real patriot. And he's also a very straightforward, what you see is what you get guy, and doesn't believe in mystery in a way. So Franklin, as in Benjamin, makes that little allusion to the American patriotism thing, and then the fact that Frank is also in there, meaning honesty, that's appropriate too. And I try not to overthink these things, but I often get the idea and then realize why I like it.
Well, and okay, let's plunge right into, we have to talk about Kevin and talk about Eva Cacciadorian, whose name is very much a foil, and whose character is very much a foil to Franklin.
That went right over my head.
I don't believe you for a second. You write in that book about Eva having an ethnic chip on her shoulder.
Certainly, yes.
So the Cacciadorian, and the fact that Kevin takes her name as well, becomes part of that tribal element.
Certainly
almost.
the name is part of the story of the book. Mm-hmm. That's true.
Okay, so I want to talk, before we get into specifics, I wanted to ask you about novels of idea. Your novels take on big themes, big ideas, social and political questions, and right now, there's a lot of discussion, especially in Canadian media. I'm sure you've read about the novel, again, the novel is dead. The idea that visit Canada more often.
Yeah,
the idea that the television is, as a storyteller, is usurping the novel. And I'm curious to know your thoughts about the novel role in culture. What the novel represents in terms of telling the bigger stories.
Well, of course, I've recently had the experience of witnessing firsthand how much bigger movies are than books. Yet at the same time, watching a movie that would not have existed if I hadn't written the book. So it's a little, I both do and don't agree with this theory. Reading is in some ways more endangered, but this whole ebook thing has ended up meaning that people read more. And the Kindle and even the iPad, people are reading more because there's something fun about the new format. It's a new toy, and it puts these kind of fusty things in toy form. And I'm not that pessimistic. I mean, I think we still have a craving for stories, and as long as we're literate, we're going to find those stories in novels a proportion of the time. And there's still using novels as at least a springboard for other forms. And I'm going to keep writing them whether they're over or not.